The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly before James Miller as he guided his mining vessel through the asteroid belt of the Rigel system. The steady hum of machinery and occasional beeping of sensors were his only companions in this remote corner of space. His weathered hands moved confidently across the control panel, years of experience guiding every motion. Just another routine extraction, he muttered to himself, watching the drill probe extend toward a promising mineral deposit. The asteroid's surface glittered with rare elements that would fetch a good price back on Earth's markets. At 32, James had spent nearly a decade in deep space mining, preferring the solitude of the cosmos to the cramped cities of Earth. The first warning came as a slight vibration in his ship's hull. James frowned, checking his sensors. Nothing showed up on the regular scanners, but something felt off. Years of working in space had given him an almost supernatural sense for danger. He began powering up his engines, preparing to move away from the asteroid. That's when he saw it, a massive ship seemingly materializing out of nowhere, its surface covered in what looked like shifting colors that had previously masked it from detection. The vessel was unlike anything in human records, organic-looking, with sweeping lines that seemed to flow like liquid metal. "This can't be good," James said, his heart racing as he fired up his engines to full power. But before his small mining vessel could build up speed, a strange purple beam shot out from the alien ship, enveloping his craft in an ethereal glow. All systems died instantly. James felt a moment of weightlessness as artificial gravity failed. Emergency lights cast an eerie red glow throughout the cabin as he floated, helpless, watching the massive alien vessel draw closer. A voice filled his cabin, speaking in a language he'd never heard before. After a few seconds, it shifted, as if adjusting itself, until he could understand the words. "Remain still. Resistance is futile. You have been selected for evaluation." James felt a tingling sensation throughout his body, and the world around him began to fade. The last thing he saw was his mining vessel being drawn into a massive hangar bay that seemed to shimmer with bioluminescent light. He awoke in a chamber that defied human architecture. The walls pulsed with soft light, and the air carried a sweet alien scent. James found himself dressed in strange, flowing garments that seemed to adjust to his body temperature. Two tall, elegant creatures stood watching him. Their skin had a pearlescent quality, and their eyes held multiple pupils that shifted and changed like kaleidoscopes. "The specimen is conscious," one said, its voice carrying a musical quality. "Prepare it for presentation to Her Majesty." "What's going on? Who are you?" James demanded, his voice steady despite his fear. The alien seemed surprised by his direct address. "It speaks with unexpected coherence," the second alien noted. "The Queen will find this interesting." James was led through corridors that seemed to be alive, the walls responding to movement by producing gentle illumination. Other aliens stopped to stare at him, some tall and elegant like his captors, others with completely different forms, but all wearing symbols that marked them as members of some vast hierarchy. Finally, they reached a vast chamber that seemed to stretch impossibly high. At its center, seated on a throne that appeared to be made of living crystal, was a being that radiated power and authority. Queen Lyra of the Stellar Empire looked down at James with eyes that contained swirling galaxies. "So this is a human," she said, her voice carrying both authority and curiosity. "The first of its kind to be brought before us." James stood straight, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I am James Miller of Earth, and I demand to know why I've been abducted." The Queen's eyes widened slightly, and something like amusement crossed her alien features. "Fascinating. It shows no fear." She rose from her throne, moving with impossible grace. "You are now my property, human. You will serve as my personal attendant, and through you, we shall learn all there is to know about your species." James clenched his fists but remained calm. "I am no one's property, Your Majesty, not even yours." The Queen's laugh echoed through the chamber. "We shall see about that, James Miller of Earth." We shall see. Days in the Queen's palace felt like a strange dream to James. The massive structure seemed to breathe, its walls shifting colors with the movement of the twin suns outside. As the Queen's personal attendant, he found himself thrust into a world of alien politics and intrigue that made his head spin. Queen Lyra kept him close, watching his every move with those galaxy-filled eyes. Her quarters were a marvel of biotechnology. Living furniture that adjusted to its users' needs, walls that could become transparent or opaque at will, and floating platforms that moved through the air like silent clouds. Attend to the environmental controls, Lyra commanded one morning, as various court officials gathered for the daily audience. James moved to the living control panel, his mining engineer's mind quickly grasping the organic technology's basic principles. The nobles watched with barely hidden disgust as his human hands touched their sacred technology. "My queen," one of the officials spoke up, his pearl-white skin glowing with agitation. "Surely it is inappropriate to let this creature handle our systems. He could damage them with his primitive understanding." James kept his face neutral as he adjusted the atmospheric settings. The living technology responded better to his touch than it did to most of the nobles, something that hadn't gone unnoticed. He discovered that the palace's systems were similar in principle to the mining equipment he'd worked with, just far more advanced. "Lord Bright," Queen Lyra responded, her voice carrying that musical tone that James had learned indicated amusement. "Your concern is noted. However, this human has shown remarkable aptitude. Did you know he detected a fault in the throne room's gravity generators yesterday? One that your own technicians missed." The noble's skin darkened in what James had learned was their version of an embarrassed blush. The other courtiers whispered among themselves, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with gossip. Later that day, as James worked on maintaining the Queen's private chambers, he overheard two servants talking in what they thought was their private language. His universal translator picked up their words clearly. "The Queen spends too much time watching the human," one said. "It's not natural. Did you see how it fixed the automated serving system?" The other replied, "No special tools, just looked at it and understood. Perhaps there's more to these humans than we thought." James smiled to himself as he continued his work. The palace's technology was amazing, but it had been neglected. The Empire had grown so dependent on their biotech that they'd forgotten the basics of maintenance and troubleshooting. His practical experience was proving surprisingly valuable. Queen Lyra entered her chambers, dismissing her other attendants with a wave. She moved to her favorite viewing platform, where the palace's living walls became transparent, showing the sprawling capital city below. "You smile more than when you first arrived," she observed, her multiple pupils focusing on him. "Are you becoming accustomed to your position?" James straightened up from his work. "On learning, Your Majesty, though I'm still not your property." Instead of anger, his response brought that musical laugh he'd grown familiar with. "You continue to fascinate me, James Miller. Most species we encounter either cower in fear or try to fight. You do neither. You adapt. Humans are good at that," he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "We have to be." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. A group of nobles burst in, led by Lord Bright. "My queen, forgive the intrusion, but the central computer core is malfunctioning. Our technicians cannot stabilize it." Lyra turned to James, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps my human attendant could take a look." James nodded, already moving toward the door. He could feel the nobles' disapproving stares, but also their desperate need for help. As he followed them to the computer core, he realized that his position in the palace was slowly changing. He wasn't just a curiosity anymore. He was becoming essential. And in the complex game of alien politics, that could be either very good or very dangerous. The assassination attempt came during what should have been a routine evening in the palace. James was performing his usual system checks in the Queen's private chambers, while she reviewed reports on her crystalline display screens. The gentle hum of the living architecture had become almost soothing to him after 3 months in the palace. Something caught his attention, a slight vibration in the floor that felt wrong. His years of mining experience had taught him to recognize the warning signs of structural stress. This vibration wasn't natural. "Your Majesty," he said suddenly, breaking protocol by speaking without being addressed first. "Something's wrong with the floor structure." Queen Lyra looked up, her galaxy eyes narrowing. Before she could respond, James was already moving toward her. The vibration had intensified. "We need to move. Now." He grabbed her arm, an action that would normally result in severe punishment, and pulled her away from her throne. The moment they moved, the floor where she had been sitting exploded upward, sending crystalline shards flying everywhere. 3 shadowy figures emerged from the hole, their bodies covered in light-absorbing material that blocked their bioluminescence. They carried weapons that pulsed with deadly energy. James didn't hesitate. He pushed the queen behind a living column that immediately hardened in response to the threat. The assassins fired, their energy weapons leaving scorch marks on the reactive architecture. "How dare you touch the queen?" one of the assassins hissed, turning their weapon toward James. "Die, primitive." But James had already grabbed a piece of the shattered floor crystal. With the precision of someone who had spent years calculating mineral fracture points, he threw it at the weapon. The crystal hit exactly where the power cell connected to the firing mechanism, causing it to short out in a spray of sparks. The queen hadn't remained idle. Her skin glowed with power as she activated the palace's defense systems. The walls themselves came alive, reaching out with crystalline tentacles to grab the attackers. But one assassin had anticipated this, throwing a device that sent out pulses of energy, temporarily paralyzing the living architecture. "The Empire must be purified," the lead assassin shouted, raising their weapon again. James saw the assassin's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, he dove forward, tackling the attacker. They rolled across the floor, fighting for control of the weapon. The assassin was stronger, their engineered body easily overpowering James's human muscles. But James fought dirty, using techniques learned in bar fights back on Earth mining colonies. The other 2 assassins moved toward the queen, but she proved she wasn't helpless. Her royal guards finally arrived, alerted by the commotion. In the chaos, James managed to wrestle the weapon free and slid it across the floor toward the queen's guards. The fight ended quickly after that. The assassins were subdued, their light-absorbing suits deactivated to reveal members of a radical purist faction within the nobility. As the guards led the assassins away, James found himself being studied by Queen Lyra with an intensity he'd never seen before. "You broke multiple protocols," she said, her voice unreadable. "You touched my person without permission. You spoke without being addressed. You acted without orders." James stood straight, his mining uniform torn and dirty. "I did, Your Majesty, and I'd do it again to save your life." "Why?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her tone. "You are a slave. Our studies show that slaves act to preserve their own lives, not those of their masters. Yet you risked death to protect me." "I'm not a slave," James replied firmly. "I'm a human being. And humans help people in danger, regardless of their status." The queen moved closer, her multiple pupils scanning his face as if searching for something. "You continue to defy everything we know about subjected species. Our records show no precedent for this behavior." "Maybe," James suggested carefully, "your records need updating." To his surprise, Queen Lyra laughed, not her usual musical tones, but something more genuine. "Perhaps they do, James Miller. Perhaps they do indeed." She turned to her guards. "From this moment, the human status is elevated. He is no longer a slave, but a personal advisor." The guards exchanged shocked looks, but no one dared question the queen's decision. James realized that everything was about to change again. Life changed dramatically for James after the assassination attempt. Instead of serving the queen, he found himself engaged in long conversations with her during the quiet evening hours. His new quarters, while still within her private wing, were luxurious by any standard, with walls that adjusted their color to match his mood. One evening, as the twin suns set outside the palace, casting rainbow shadows through the crystal walls, Queen Lyra asked him about Earth. She sat across from him on a living chair that adjusted to her form, her skin glowing with subtle patterns of curiosity. "Tell me," she said, "how do humans form bonds without telepathic links? How do you know who to trust?" James thought carefully before answering. "We learn to read each other through actions, words, and body language. Trust is earned over time, not instantly granted through biological connections." "That seems inefficient," Lyra noted, her galaxy eyes swirling with interest. "Yet your species has achieved remarkable things despite this limitation." "We don't see it as a limitation," James explained. "The effort required to build trust makes it more valuable. When someone chooses to be loyal rather than being programmed for it, that loyalty means more." The Queen's skin patterns shifted to a deeper hue. "Like when you chose to save my life." "Exactly," James nodded. "I did that because I believed it was right, not because I was compelled to." Their conversations often went late into the night. James learned about the burden of ruling an empire spanning thousands of worlds. Lyra spoke of the constant political maneuvering, the weight of traditions thousands of years old, and the loneliness of being the final authority on everything. "Sometimes," she admitted one night, her luminescence dimmed to barely a glow, "I envy your freedom. Every decision I make affects billions of lives across countless worlds." James sat quietly for a moment, watching the city lights below. Having power doesn't mean you have to carry the burden alone. On Earth, even our most powerful leaders have advisors, friends, people they can trust. "Friends," Lyra tested the word. "We have no equivalent concept. The closest would be political allies, but those relationships are based on mutual benefit, not, what did you call it, trust." As days passed, James noticed subtle changes in how the Queen conducted her court. She began asking more questions, listening to different perspectives before making decisions. Some of the older nobles grumbled about these changes, but others, especially younger members of the court, seemed intrigued by this new approach. During one memorable evening, Lyra asked James to teach her a human custom. He chose to show her how to shake hands, a simple gesture, but one loaded with meaning in human culture. "This is how we often greet each other," he explained, extending his hand. It started as a way to show we weren't carrying weapons, but became a symbol of trust and equality. Lyra studied his outstretched hand with fascination. Slowly, she extended her own, her pearlescent fingers meeting his. The touch was electric, quite literally, as a small spark of bioluminescence jumped between them. "How strange," she murmured, her skin patterns shifting rapidly. "Such a simple gesture, yet I feel something unusual." "That's the power of voluntary connection," James said softly. "It means more because we both chose it." Their hands remained joined longer than a typical handshake, neither quite willing to break the connection. Finally, Lyra withdrew, her galaxy eyes showing colors James had never seen before. "I begin to understand why your species has survived despite its apparent limitations," she said. "There is strength in your way of forming connections." James noticed her patterns had shifted to colors he'd learned indicated deep thought and emotional complexity. "Your Majesty, are you all right?" "Yes," she replied slowly. "I'm just beginning to see many things differently, James Miller, and I'm not certain if that should frighten or excite me." As James left her chambers that night, he realized that he too was seeing things differently. The Queen was no longer just his captor or even just his ruler. She was becoming something else entirely, and that thought both thrilled and terrified him. The warning came at dawn, when the first sun was just peeking over the crystal spires of the capital. James woke to the sound of fighting in the palace corridors. The living walls of his quarters pulsed with warning patterns he'd never seen before. "James, The Queen's voice came through his room's communication system. "Come to my chambers immediately. Use the maintenance tunnels." He was already moving, grabbing the portable diagnostic tool he'd modified with human engineering principles. The hidden door to the maintenance tunnels opened at his touch, a privilege granted to him after he'd proven his worth with the palace systems. As he crawled through the biomechanical passages, he could hear the sounds of combat above. The rebels had somehow managed to disable many of the palace's automated defenses. James's knowledge of the systems told him this was no amateur operation. This was a carefully planned coup. He found Queen Lyra in her chambers, her usual regal composure replaced by battle readiness. Her skin glowed with power patterns, and she held what looked like a living weapon that pulsed in sync with her bioluminescence. "The purists have made their move," she said without preamble. "They've turned half the royal guard and disabled our primary defense grid. Lord Bright leads them." "I knew that pompous glowworm was trouble," James muttered, making Lyra's patterns flicker briefly with amusement despite the situation. "What's their goal?" "To purify the Empire," she spat the words. "They claim I've been corrupted by alien influence, meaning you, and that I'm unfit to rule." The door to the chambers shuddered under heavy impact. The rebels were trying to break through. "We need to move," James said, already moving toward the maintenance tunnel entrance. "I know these passages better than anyone in the palace. They connect to the old catacombs beneath the city." Another explosion rocked the chambers. The living walls screamed in pain, a sound James had never wanted to hear again after his first maintenance accident. "My queen," Lord Bright's voice boomed through the door. "Surrender the human and submit to purification. The Empire must be cleansed of primitive influences." Lyra's response was to fire her weapon at the door, sealing it with crystalline growth. "Lead the way, James. I trust you." They dove into the maintenance tunnel just as the main door exploded inward. James sealed the tunnel entrance behind them, using his modified tool to scramble its biosignature so it wouldn't respond to normal palace commands. The tunnels were a maze of organic and mechanical systems, pulsing with the lifeblood of the palace. James led them through passages barely wide enough for Lyra's tall frame, using his knowledge of the maintenance systems to avoid dead ends and traps. "How did you learn these paths so well?" Lyra asked as they crouched in a junction, listening for pursuers. "I spent every free moment exploring them," James replied, checking his tool's readings. "On mining ships, knowing your emergency routes can mean the difference between life and death. Old habits die hard." They heard voices ahead. Rebels had found another entrance to the tunnels. James guided them down a smaller side passage. One he discovered led to the ancient catacombs beneath the palace. "The old kings built escape tunnels," he explained, "before your species developed biotechnology. They're completely mechanical, so the rebels can't track us through them." As they descended deeper into the catacombs, Lyra's natural glow provided their only light. The air grew stale, and the walls were simple stone rather than living crystal. "I never knew these existed," Lyra admitted, touching the ancient walls. "So much of our history has been forgotten in our rush to prove our superiority." A distant explosion reminded them of their pursuers. James took Lyra's hand to guide her through a particularly dark section, and she didn't pull away. "We need to reach the lower city," he said. "I know some people there who don't exactly love the nobility. They might help us." "Criminals and outcasts?" Lyra asked, but without judgment. "Sometimes, Your Majesty," James replied with a grim smile. "The best allies are the ones the Empire forgot." Deep in the lower city's twisted streets, James and Lyra found refuge in an abandoned maintenance hub. The Queen's bioluminescence was dimmed to its lowest level, making her look almost human in the shadows. They'd been hiding for 3 days, moving between safe houses James had discovered during his maintenance work. "The reports from the surface are getting worse," James said, checking a salvaged communication device. "Lord Bright's forces are rounding up any species they consider primitive. They're using the palace's biological systems to track anyone with non-imperial DNA." Lyra sat on a makeshift chair, her usual perfect posture replaced by exhaustion. Everything I believed about our superiority. It was all built on ignorance, wasn't it? What do you mean? James asked, sitting beside her. Look at this place, she gestured to the hub. While we lived in our crystal towers, believing our biotechnology made us supreme, the lower city developed its own kind of strength. These people, humans, off-worlders, even outcast Imperials, they work together, adapt, survive. A noise from above made them both freeze, but it was just the regular rumble of the transit tubes. James relaxed slightly but kept his hand near the modified maintenance tool he'd turned into a weapon. Our empire's been stagnant, Lyra continued, her galaxy eyes swirling with new understanding. We stopped growing, stopped learning. We just kept repeating the same patterns, believing we were perfect. No species is perfect, James said softly. But that's what makes life interesting. On Earth, we have a saying, perfection is the enemy of progress. Lyra's skin patterns shifted to show deep thought. In the past weeks, hiding among these people, I've seen more innovation and adaptation than in centuries of court life. That merchant who combined imperial biotech with off-world mechanics to make better food preservation systems. Or the street doctor using earth medicine with your species' healing abilities, James added. When different cultures mix, amazing things happen. And that's what terrifies them, Lyra realized, her patterns brightening with sudden clarity. Lord Bright and his purists, they're not afraid of contamination. They're afraid of change. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Through the grime-covered windows, they saw a group of Imperial guards harassing a family of mixed species. The scene made Lyra's patterns pulse with anger. This has to stop, she said, rising. I've been hiding when I should have been fighting. What are you thinking? James asked, recognizing the determination in her stance. The Empire's strength was never in our purity, she declared. It was in our ability to adapt, to absorb new ideas, new species. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. We became so focused on maintaining what we had that we stopped growing. She turned to James, her galaxy eyes blazing with purpose. I need your help, not as a servant or advisor, but as an equal. The lower city is full of people who've been pushed aside by the Empire's obsession with purity. If we can unite them, a revolution. James raised an eyebrow. Against the most powerful biotechnological force in known space. No, Lyra's patterns shifted to show excitement. Not against the Empire. For it. To remind everyone what made us great in the first place. Our ability to change, to grow, to become more than we were. James studied her for a moment. The queen he'd first met, proud, distant, convinced of her species' superiority, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that true strength came from diversity, from the chaos and beauty of different cultures and species working together. I'm with you, he said simply. Where do we start? Lyra's response was interrupted by shouting from the street. The Imperial guards were getting rough with the family. Without hesitation, she moved toward the door. We start right here, she said. No more hiding. It's time to show the Empire a different kind of strength. As they prepared to face whatever came next, James realized that the revolution had already begun, not in the streets or the palace, but in the heart and mind of an alien queen who had learned to see beyond the limitations of her own culture. 1 year after the uprising began in the lower city, the Imperial Palace looked very different. The living crystal walls now pulsed with patterns from a dozen different species, and the grand throne room had been transformed into a council chamber where representatives from all worlds could speak freely. James stood by the main window, watching ships from across the galaxy dock at the newly constructed spaceport. The sight of human vessels mixing with Imperial ships still brought a smile to his face. Earth had become one of the Empire's strongest allies, contributing practical engineering knowledge that complemented Imperial biotechnology. Lost in thought, Lyra's voice came from behind him. She moved to stand beside him, her bioluminescence synchronized with his presence, a sign of deep emotional connection in her species. "Remembering," he replied. "Hard to believe it's been a year since we led that charge from the lower city." The revolution had succeeded not through force, but through unity. When the people saw their queen fighting alongside humans, outcasts, and common citizens, the purists' claims of superiority fell apart. Lord Bright's support had crumbled as worlds across the Empire chose reform over regression. "The new trade agreements are exceeding expectations," Lyra said, her patterns showing pleasure. "The combination of human mining techniques with our biotechnology has opened up resources we never thought possible." "And the education exchange program?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. 300 Imperial students are now studying on Earth, and we have just as many humans learning our sciences here." Her galaxy eyes sparkled. "Their questions are refreshing. They make us see our own technology in new ways." A small commotion at the chamber entrance drew their attention. A group of children, human, Imperial, and several other species, ran past, playing with a hover ball that combined Earth sports with Imperial biomechanics. Guards who once would have stopped such behavior now simply smiled and made sure the children didn't break anything too valuable. "The council meeting starts soon," James reminded her. "They're voting on the new constitution today." Lyra's patterns shifted to show determination. The final step. No more absolute monarchy. No more rigid hierarchies. A true confederation of equals. They walked together toward the council chamber, passing walls where ancient imperial pronouncements now hung beside artwork from 100 worlds. The Empire had changed more in 1 year than in the previous 1,000. "There will still be resistance," James said. "Change isn't easy for any species." "No," Lyra agreed, "but it's necessary. And we're stronger together than we ever were apart." They entered the council chamber to find it already filled with representatives from across the galaxy. The old noble houses sat alongside delegates from Earth, former slave species, and even some civilizations that had once been enemies of the Empire. As Lyra took her place, no longer on a throne, but at a round table with all the others, James moved to the Earth delegation section. Their eyes met across the chamber, and her patterns glowed with the colors that he had learned meant love. Their relationship had scandalized the old guard, but became a symbol of the new empire. The first human imperial marriage in history had sparked controversy, scientific interest, and ultimately, celebration across the worlds. The council session began, and James watched with pride as Lyra guided the discussions with wisdom and humility. She had transformed from an absolute monarch into something far more valuable, a leader who understood that true power came from unity and diversity. As the vote for the new constitution began, James thought about how far they'd come. From captor and slave, to allies, to lovers, to partners in creating something entirely new. The empire had been reborn, not through conquest or purity, but through understanding and acceptance. The final vote was unanimous. As cheers filled the chamber, Lyra's eyes found his again, and her patterns showed the same thought he was having. This was just the beginning. The galaxy was changing, growing, becoming more than anyone had imagined possible. And it had all started because an alien queen had learned to love a human who refused to be enslaved. The end.